Yeah, and another quick thing is please try not to spam the chat with messages that aren't needed. And let me get my screen share set up. Okay. So screen share. Oh, button. All right, so everyone can see my screen, right? All right, so let's start with it. Once again, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A, please, unless I tell you to do otherwise, if we're having a discussion of somewhat. But if you have any questions, put it in the Q&A. I'll try to answer it as quick as possible. All right, so this is the last class for Teach Kid biology. And today we'll discuss ecology, which is the more macroscopic side of biology, I guess. So quick, let's do a recap. So in the last class, we discussed human physiology, or the set of chemical and physical processes that control how our body works. In previous classes, we discussed the more microscopic areas of biology, such as cell biology and genetics. So yesterday, we specifically covered the nervous system, the immune system, and the cardiovascular system, which are three of the key systems that are tested in various biology competitions, such as the USABO, and some of these are also going to be tested in Science Olympiad in future seasons. So in this class today, we will discuss the interaction between different organisms and their environment, or ecology. So let's give a brief overview of ecology. So ecology, like we said earlier, details these interactions between organisms and their environment. But there's multiple layers to ecology because there's obviously different levels of interactions that can occur. So the first one we have here that we're going to discuss is population ecology, which details the interactions between organisms of the same species. For example, two humans interacting with each other. Then we have community ecology, which details the interactions between organisms of different species. So it's like interspecific. Then we talk about ecosystem ecology, which is the interaction between a community and its non-living or abiotic factors. For example, interaction between the community and the water system. And then we have the ecosystem, and then we have the landscape ecology, which is all these connected ecosystems together in different biomes, etc. And finally, we have the global ecology, which is a study of the biosphere, or the sum of Earth's ecosystems and landscapes, and details how all these biomes come together to produce a functional Earth that we all live in. So let's talk about first here. Before we talk about the specifics of organismal interactions, let's talk a bit about climate, because climate definitely determines how organisms are dispersed and the overall abundance of them and their interactions. So firstly, let's talk about the global climate. Global climate patterns are determined by the input of solar radiation that dictate many energetic processes, or processes that have to do with the ecosystems that are specific to energy. So some areas have a microclimate, which are very fine and localized patterns in the climatic conditions. For example, in a certain region of a biome or a certain region of an ecosystem, there could be a certain climate that covers over it over a really long time. But then global climate change, which is another important topic to know about, is a directional change in climate that lasts 3 decades or more. So right now we're obviously seeing global change with the polar ice caps melting, etc. So this global climate change is a directional change towards increasing temperatures that last 3 decades or more. And the issue with global climate change is that because different organisms have to live in specific temperature ranges, we're seeing a lot of organisms moving across their biomes and switching to newer biomes in order to find an area that matches their temperature needs. So for example, if it's getting a lot hard, since it's getting a lot hotter in these ecosystems, we're seeing a lot more animals migrating northward because the temperature is much lower, but it's going to balance out because rising temperatures are happening. And because of this, we see that much of ecology is actually affected by climate change. And another thing right here is the climate graph. Let me get the pointer here. So the climate graph shows the distribution of the biomes based on their climate. So this is one example of a climate graph. You can see the climate for Southeast Nebraska. You see in certain areas such as June and July, you read this by like these bars represent the precipitation, and these things right here the lines like that are curving represent the temperatures. So we can see here that the precipitations are really high in the summer months, and temperatures are also really high in the summer months. They sort of wane downwards. In addition to climate, I don't have a slide for this, I believe, but there are other factors as well that we'll discuss that affect organism interactions. They include like precipitation, for example, and nutrient availability. So all of these come together to affect our interactions, as we'll see when we talk about ecosystem ecology. Okay, so next, let's talk about the distribution of organisms. So just as much as the organismal interactions are important, the distribution of where organisms are dictates these interactions, because if two organisms are in the same area, and they're more likely to interact with each other and produce these ecological outcomes. So therefore, an essential question in geography and ecology is, why do organisms appear in the areas that they do appear in? So there's three areas where scientists have tried to figure it out. Firstly, it has to do with dispersal. So dispersal highlights the movement of individuals away from their area of origin or from centers of high population density. We talked about this earlier, how different organisms can disperse from where they already were due to climate change to find cooler climates. But there's other ways that this can happen in random processes. One way details the ability of an organism to disperse. Let's take birds, for example. Birds can fly, and therefore they can go to different areas much quickly than we do, which is why they have all these migration patterns in the winter. But birds will be more able to disperse from their environment than a kangaroo in Australia, for example, because Australia is pretty much not landlocked, but it's not really connected to other masses of land. So therefore, you see kangaroos are mainly just isolated in Australia and those regions because they can't disperse. And then you have birds, which can pretty much go anywhere they want to, since they can travel over ocean since they fly. This describes range expansion, which characterizes how different organisms can reach an area that they have not reached beforehand. And then this can cause adaptive radiation. What I mean by adaptive radiation is that when different organisms separate from different environments, these different environments will necessitate the organisms to have different functions or different roles in the environment or niches. For example, in one environment that it goes to, it might be more important to like feed at a different part of day, which can give it a new niche or role in that environment, causing adaptive radiation, where we see differences between the main population and the new population. Secondly, we have biotic factors. So biotic and abiotic refers to living or non-living factors. So biotic factors would be other organisms, and biotic factors in terms of like dispersion and distribution of organisms would refer to how these other species limit the distribution of organisms. As you might have guessed, this has to do mainly with predation. For example, if there's, let me think about it this way. If there's like a circle of land right here, and at one part of it, there is a lot of predators for a species, you probably wouldn't expect a lot of the prey species to move up there because this like predator species would limit how it could move. But then it would be abiotic factors, how these non-living structures limit the distribution. For example, in a certain ecosystem, there could be a lack of oxygen or a lack of precipitation or bad climate that the organism cannot survive in, or just very simple things. For example, if there's a mountain, then obviously there's like a mouse and it's trying to move. If there's a mountain blocking its way, it's probably not going to be able to cross the mountain. But a bird, for example, could probably cross the mountain by flying over it or like hill. So one thing right here, I think this, I forgot what organism this is for, but it shows the dispersion of, I think, a cattle egret. So you can see how it dispersed over time. We have different areas, for example, in like the 60s and the 50s, and then it kind of went off in like both directions right here. So it just shows how these different populations can disperse. And now, even though they might have started around here in Central America-ish, they can move all the way to like North America and South America. So that shows another area of distribution. So let's talk a bit more about distribution of these organisms. So another thing that these organisms' distribution is also characterized and controlled by disturbance. And disturbance can be any change to the environment, and it can be both natural and human-induced. You'll see a lot of articles that are like, look at all the human disturbance going on. And while humans are disturbing a lot of environments, disturbance isn't something that's like bad necessarily. I mean, obviously when humans disturb it, it's pretty bad for the environment because it's unnatural. But natural forms of disturbance do occur and are necessary for environments to grow. For example, take like natural wildfires. A lot of these are pretty important, even though they're increased frequency due to human activity. like wildfires at its core are important because they can take out trees that are old and not committing or not actually helping the environment, and it can sprout a lot more new seeds to make a new thriving ecosystem. So this disturbance can happen. There's 3 types of disturbance an ecosystem can have. There is like slow amounts of disturbance, medium amounts, and high amounts. And a lot of studies, I'm not going to go into the specifics of the studies, but a lot of studies have found that the medium levels of disturbance are much better, because if you have low levels of disturbance to an environment, then there's less of a turnover of species. So a lot of old species just accumulate there. But if there's so much disturbance, if there's like a high amount of wildfires, for example, then that means that all the organisms would pretty much die in the forest. So that would hurt it. So medium levels of disturbance are pretty much what's needed to have this fine balance between the two. So another way of disturbance it can influence the type of vegetation found on biomes, which is why it's really important. And you can see right here, agriculture is one form of human disturbance, because obviously plants weren't made to like be put in orderly arrays. So this is one form of human disturbance, agriculture. All right, so now that we talked a bit about just general stuff about ecology, let's talk a bit more about the specific levels of ecology. We'll go over the main 3 in this class. I think we'll go over population ecology. Then we're going to go over community ecology. Then we're going to go over ecosystem ecology to cap off the class. So first, let's discuss population ecology. And like we talked about earlier with the population, it's just a group of individuals of a single species living in the same general area. That's really important. If they're asking for the population count of like a certain species, don't add other species into that count when you're doing the calculation. Density describes the number of individuals per unit area or volume. For example, let's say there's 5,000 individuals per square mile. That describes the density or the concentration of these individuals in the environment. Then we have population dispersion, which is the pattern of spacing among different individuals within the boundary of the population. We'll talk about that in the next slide more specifically, though. But it's like how the organisms are distributed within a certain boundary. And then we can estimate population size via the mark and recapture method. So the mark and recapture method basically let's explain it this way. I have a diagram on the left to make it easier, but we want to so sometimes, right, when population ecologists want to figure out how many like fish in this example are in the population, they do sort of a method that involves ratios. So what they do is they sample the population, but they can't just count all the fish there. What if there's like 1,000 fish in the lake? They're not gonna be able to count all of that. So what they do is they sample some fish in a certain amount of time frame. So for here, we see all fish in the pond are unmarked, so just normal fish in a pond. And for the mark and recapture method, we pretty much have to assume that other organisms aren't coming in, organisms aren't leaving, organisms aren't dying, organisms aren't being born again. So it's a rough estimate. But so here, let's say the fisher person caught 10 fish. So they mark them, let's say, with like a tag or like a sticky note, or not sticky note, that would fall off, or like a marker. Some way that they can mark them to realize if they saw that fish ever again, that would be marked. So then they release it back into the pond, where it just mingles, I guess, with the other normal fish. And the pond is resampled again sometime later, and we see a certain amount of fish come up, and we show that 5 of these fish are marked and 5 of these fish are unmarked, which so basically what happens is we're taking a certain amount and we're dispersing within the population. We take a random sample of that, and usually a rough estimate of the population density of the ones that are tagged can be found by the ones that are marked over the amount of tagged fish. For example, let's say we have 5 marked fish and 5 unmarked fish that are captured. That means roughly 50% of the population would be marked and 50% of the population would be unmarked. But knowing that 10 fish are already captured, we see 10 fish is 50% of the population, meaning there's roughly 20 fish in the pond. Does that make sense? Just put that in chat if I should explain that a bit better, or that's good. All right, no one has any questions about it. I guess I'll move on a bit. We can also like answer questions later. But yeah, that's the mark and recapture method. The reason I highlighted this in red, I actually don't highlight things in red, but the mark and recapture method is a pretty important concept tested in USABO. I've seen it, or Biology Olympiad. I've seen it being tested like multiple times. It's a common question that they ask. So be aware of how this calculation works, because sometimes they'll say like, oh, you tagged a certain amount of fish in a population. Yeah. Now let's talk a bit more about patterns of dispersion. Okay, I'm sorry if you can't read this because it's black on black right here, but there's some red to sort of show it. So there's 3 types of dispersion patterns, or how they're distributed. We have clumped. Clumped is right here, which means that animals would clump in areas where, let's say, nutrients were abundant, for example. That's just an example. There's other reasons why it would occur. But let's say we have all these animals that are clumped right here. There's like a nutrient hotspot over here, over here, over here, over here, over here. Just a bunch of hotspots of nutrients. And then we have uniform, which is right here. So each animal, this is one example of uniform, where each animal sort of marks its own territory and other animals respect it. This is like in penguins, where they're not, when like they're taking care of their youngling eggs. You can see that there's a huge degree of territoriality where it's like, you don't get in my territory, I won't invade yours. They sort of stay in this uniform dispersion, sort of like grids on an array, or points on a grid is uniform. And then we have random dispersion, which is, like it says, it's completely random. There's nothing determining how something disperses. And so a good example of that would be like flowers. So whenever flowers are grown, some flowers are, like the seeds go to different areas based on the wind. It just like flies with the wind and goes to the ground and plants a flower. So since the wind is pretty random, there's no direction that the wind blowing the seeds into. These seeds are going to go randomly and disperse there, which forms random dispersion. All right, 3 types of dispersion right there. Okay, so a bit more into populations. Let's talk about how the population size changes over time and the demographic of it. So this is survivorship curves and life tables. So survivorship curve is seen on the right. It's sort of like a graph, and it plots the proportion or numbers in a certain age group at each age, or like numbers of individuals surviving. And the data to make this type of graph is determined from a life table, which is right here. So you can see these different age cohorts or sample sizes. We have a 0 to 9, for example. And let's say we have a certain amount of like 100 people originally. Mortality rate describes the amount of people that die in that age group. Survival rate is 1 minus the mortality rate, because it's the amount that survive. So the amount that survive plus the amount that die should equal the total population. Then we have the survivorship here, right here. Give me a survivorship. And you don't need to worry about that. Fertility, really need to worry about that. But like these 2 are the most important ones, or important factors. And then we can see about how like over time, this data can be plotted on the survivorship curve. So there's different types of curves here on the graph. We have a type 1 curve, a type 2 curve, and a type 3 curve. Let's talk about each 3 of these individually. A type 1 curve, as you can see right here, an age in relative units and number of survivors. This can be described by humans. For example, whenever we're young, we survive a lot. And then over time, the human population tends to decline age cohort whenever we're a lot older. For example, like right here, we suddenly decline, but we have a good amount of survivorship and survival rate whenever we're younger and adults. But then we have type 2 survivorship curves, which means that no matter what age they are, the organism's same likely to die or survive. That can be described by birds or like ducks in this example, like the chicks. So like right here, even if they're like 5 years old, they're just as likely to survive or die compared if they're 50, which is why that's a linear curve. And then we have one right here, which is the type 3 survivorship curve, which this is actually an interesting curve right here. It's described by trees. So what happens is whenever a organism is very young, it is more likely to die. And then over time, if it survives to a higher age, it's going to survive for a really long time after that. That's why I see some trees that go on for a really long time and survive for like hundreds and like maybe thousands of years. So let's talk about why type 3 and type 1 survivorship curves are needed. So let's look at type 3 survivorship curves and let's analyze the different organisms that can do it. One possible organism that can also do a type 3 survivorship curve is a fish. So why is it necessary for these fish to die off really young? So what happens is these fish, let's say they're in aquatic biomes, and aquatic biomes are very unpredictable since you have a lot of different organisms and predator-prey interactions all clustered together. So in these organisms, it's much more important that they have much more offspring released because they don't care how many survive. They just want a lot of them to be released, and maybe there's a good chance that at least some of them survive to an older age. So they do like sort of like a boom. I like to say like a boom, where there's like a bunch of them are just released at the same time. They don't really care for the offspring, but then over time, some of them survive and reproduce. Whereas humans, we take a lot of parental care over like offspring. That's why the offspring survive for a very long time until a later age where they're obviously older and survival rate isn't as high. So that pretty much describes between type 1 and type 3 survivorship curves. So let's talk a bit more about how population size can change. So there's births, or like making new offspring, and immigration, which is moving into a population from another population, which increases population size. Then there's death and emigration, which is how an organism moves out of a population, and then that decreases population size because the population is getting lower if more organisms are leaving. So there's two ways of population growth models. The first one is exponential growth, which means that over time the population grows exponentially, or like doubles after every year. So this is how it would be growing. That's exponential growth model. But then there's logistic growth, which shows that populations only grow up until a certain carrying capacity, which is the amount, or like the maximum number of organisms that can actually like survive based on the amount of resources there. So you can see right here, it grows in logistic growth. It grows a lot more rapidly, at around like half the population carrying capacity. And then because there's obviously some more organisms that can actually produce, but it's not hitting the carrying capacity yet. But then once you reach the carrying capacity, it's going to be less able to reproduce more because there's less nutrients to support new offspring. Another pretty cool thing is that these logistic growth models aren't just applied to ecology. In so many other different, if you go in depth in biology, if you want to like the USAVO, you'll read about how a lot of different biological processes are dictated by this type of growth model. For example, how certain molecules bind to enzymes, how oxygen is transported in your blood. They all really depend on this type of model, but that's beyond the scope of this discussion. So yeah, those are the two types of growth models. You have the exponential growth and logistic growth. But one thing about the carrying capacity I said that's like the maximum number of organisms that a population can support. However, sometimes organisms can act, or populations, I should say, can overshoot the carrying capacity. What I mean by this is, actually, let me get my snippet out. So I'll do another drawing thing. Let me pull that out. Yeah, let me get back on the screen share. So share. All right. So let's draw a graph right here. When we have our carrying capacity, we can highlight that in blue or black, I guess. Here. We'll describe, this is not a good line, but we'll describe it as K for now. So actually I can just use paint. Yeah, I could probably use paint. That's probably better. Yeah, I'll probably draw a lot better on paint. Let's get this deleted. Okay. So right here, let's use paint. So let's have a graph, I guess. And whenever we're seeing the carrying capacity of a graph, we have it like here. This is the carrying capacity. So sometimes on a normal logistic growth model, we would see that's like this. We would expect it to be like that, where at around half the population size, it grows a lot rapidly until it reaches the carrying capacity. But in some organisms, such as like a fly, what actually happens is it goes like this. It goes above it, and then it goes right back down, and then it reaches the carrying capacity. So why does this happen? So obviously, organisms are gonna keep reproducing. Even if there's like imaginary number that's the carrying capacity, it's not going to stop the organisms from reproducing. What's going to happen is once they like reach this above value right here, all these organisms at the top are probably going to die off, since the population is already so high that it can't support them, which is why the population goes right back down below the carrying capacity and sort of just equilibrates around here like this. So that's describes that part. So that's the carrying capacity. What's this? Okay. The next we'll need to get the Q&A back up. The next we'll describe density dependent versus density independent factors. So these factors also determine how a population is growing. And so there's two main ones that we want to talk about here. Density independent factors means that it doesn't change with increasing population densities. For example, let's say there's a drought. The drought's not going to be more severe or less severe if there is less or higher population. Like the drought's going to kill the same amount of vegetation regardless of how many people are there. But also there's like an external factor killing the vegetation. For example, let's say there's like some pesticide being released. Doesn't matter how many animals there are, the vegetation that they need to survive will be killed the same rate. And there's density dependent factors, which means that it does change with increasing or decreasing population. For example, disease. If we have a high amount of people in a population, then disease is more likely to spread because population density increases disease spread. That's why in COVID-19 outbreaks, you saw a lot of the COVID outbreaks centered in areas with high population density, such as like LA or New York, compared to like the Midwest, where there's not that many people there. And then you have competition for resources, which is how with more people there, there's gonna be more competition for smaller amounts of resources, which also describes the carrying capacity there. So this basically just shows, you don't have to worry about this, but to show that density independent death rate is always going to be the same, whereas density dependent death rate is going to increase or decrease. So next we'll talk about community ecology. So community ecology describes the interactions between communities and different species, and it can either be helpful, harmful, or neutral to a participating organism. So another key term to know, symbiosis. It describes the interaction between two different organisms living in close physical association. It's key. Symbiosis isn't just like one organism helping another organism. They have to be they have to live in close and physical association with each other. So the first one we're going to talk about here is competition. Competition is a negative interaction. What I mean by that is that both organisms will be harmed in competition because they're basically like limiting the amount of nutrients that they would have gotten. So we talked about the word niche earlier. Niche basically describes the organism's function or roles and the amount of nutrients they need, or the similar nutrients that they really need. So when organisms compete, they usually have similar ecological niches. So therefore they must that necessitates competition. Like, okay, we're both to compete for the same amount of worms, for example, for birds. Competition typically harms both organisms unless they can adapt to only living a subset of that niche. So there's the realized niche and the fundamental niche. They're the two types. The fundamental niche is usually it's usually the part that it's actually doing, or it's the part that it would ideally occupy. For example, it would be if you have two birds competing for worms, the fundamental niche would be taking up all the worms and eating that. But the realized niche is realizing that, okay, this is what's actually happening, and it's typically only a subset of the fundamental niche. Sometimes the fundamental niche can be smaller than the realized niche, but that's beyond the scope of the discussion, and it's not really needed to know. They don't really test that. So yeah, so we talked about here, and the way that they take a subset of that niche is called resource partitioning, or they partition or split up the resources. Let's take here, the niche of these birds is to live in this tree. But they all can live in the same spaces because they're not part of the same population. So what they do is, this bird right here might live on the top and sides. This bird might live in the middle. This bird might live at the very tippity top. This one might live in the middle as well, down here. And this bird might live in the very bottom of the tree. So while their fundamental niche might be to live in the entire tree, the realized niche, because of competition with other organisms, that they have to live in a subset of that fundamental niche or the realized niche. A cool experiment that I saw earlier was, let me get paint back on. Okay, I don't have the actual picture of it with me right now, but there is a shore. Let me delete that. So there's a shore right here. Can I make this go the other way or no? But that's unfortunate. But we have a shore. Oh wait, not triangle. Let's do this. All right, so yeah, we have a shore right here, on the beach. Draw like a triangle, and we have these different clams. So we have one species of clams. I'm just going to draw it in maroon, that lives at the top of the shore. We have another species of clams that lives at the bottom of the shore right here. So scientists are wondering, why do they live at the bottom or top of the shore, and why not they live dispersed with each other? So what they did was they removed these this clam, the maroon clam, from the population once, and they wanted to see how this would affect the actual blue clam. So when they did that, they saw that over time, the blue clam started to populate the rest of the environment like this. And the same happened vice versa. So it shows that they partitioned a part of their environment so that they'd only live in a subset of that fundamental niche or the realized niche. That's one example of resource partitioning. So next we'll talk about predation. So just like it says, predation is one organism eating another organism. Pretty simple. But there's a lot of, the main thing about predation that the tests such as the USABO tests are about how animals defend themselves from predation. So they developed a lot of different adaptations that avoid them from being eaten. The first is mechanical defense. You have a porcupine, very spiky, so organisms won't tend to eat it because it's spiky. But then you have some other things such as chemical defenses, which aren't on the slide. But chemical defenses would be like a skunk farting, which is a pretty bad smell. So organisms would be less likely to eat it. Then there's Predation mimicry. So the three Predation, aposematic, and Mullerian mimicry are very important to know for the USABO test if you're planning on doing biology Olympiad. So Predation mimicry is a harmless animal disguises itself as a harmful animal. So right here would be a good one. You have the eastern coral snake and the scarlet king snake, which is non-venomous. But in the eastern coral snake, which is venomous, they basically look the same though. So if an organism knows not to eat the eastern coral snake, it will know not to eat the scarlet king snake because they basically look the same. So this one can have a defense against it. A funny story about Predation mimicry, which is not involved with the lesson, is that one time I was doing a biology competition, and this one I was first getting started into biology, so they're around 8th grade. And it was like a buzzer, sort of like quiz bowl style biology competition. And it was a question, it was like, what type of mimicry is this? And I knew it was Predation mimicry, but I guess because I was thinking about too much Minecraft that day, I said Bastian mimicry, and I got the question wrong because you had to get it exactly correct. So that's why I make sure to have all these like names down. So it's Predation mimicry, not Bastian mimicry. But yeah, the other two types are aposematic coloration. Aposematic coloration is a harmful animal that has bright colors that serve as a warning. So it's like warning coloration, probably the best way to describe it. You have this poison dart frog right here. Obviously, when you see a poison dart frog, you innately know that it's probably not to be messed with. You don't really want to eat it. It'll probably kill you. So yeah, that's the warning coloration there. And you can also see like the eastern coral snake has this like venomous warning coloration with the stripes. And so the scarlet king snake makes advantage of that. Then we have Mullerian mimicry. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. I know the U has like 2 dots on it, but suffice it to say that it's when 2 harmful species or unpalatable species, they mimic each other. So there's monarch and viceroy butterflies, which are both toxic to this predator, which would cause that predator to not eat both of them. So yeah, those are 3 types of mainly defense. And then we have mutualism, which most of y'all are probably familiar with. So mutualism is when both species actually benefit. So it's a plus-plus interaction. This is good. So there's 2 main types in mutualism. One very, 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 very important one, mycorrhizal interactions. Also very commonly tested on the USABO. So fungi get nutrients from it's basically the mutualistic adaptations and interaction between a fungi and a plant. And very important to the plant's early evolution cycles. I might talk about this, but we have fungi, which get nutrients from the plant. The plant also gets nutrients from the fungi. So what happens is, let's say in an environment, in like a soil, plants need a lot of nitrogen, but it's kind of hard to get nitrogen since nitrogen is usually in the air and they can't just like take in nitrogen like they take in carbon dioxide. They have to get it from the soil. But fungi have no issue taking up this, taking up this nitrogen. So what they do is they transport the nitrogen to the plants. And in return, the plants give the fungi the sugar that the fungi needs because the plants make sugar through photosynthesis. So they divert some of that sugar to the fungi in the mycorrhizal interactions. Then there's pollination, which you are probably familiar with as well. Pollination, whenever the bee gets nectar, or like a bee or any pollinating organism gets nectar from a flower, and then the plant spreads its pollen by like attaching it to the bee or bird. And then the bird or bee, whatever pollinating organism, spreads that to other different species where the plant can reproduce. That's pollination. So there's a lot of forms of mutualism in the environment, but those are just 2 main ones that I wanted to highlight because they're obviously important. I'm gonna talk a bit more about mycorrhizae. So mycorrhizae interactions are also really important, and I say that they're important to be tested on because it sort of described how plants adapted to their environment. Whenever plants made the move to terrestrial like areas, because plants are not always in plants when they're originally they're like in the water, right? And these other life forms like algae, and they evolved into terrestrial plants. And at the time, the plants didn't have the ability to like fix the nitrogen in the soil to use it. So what they did was they had fungi that associated with them and made the long-lasting evolutionary interaction between the two. And then pollination as well. This also begs the question of like how evolution works, like in the first class we talked about, because a plant is more likely to adapt itself to something that a pollinator can recognize. That's why there's a certain purple that bees can recognize called bees purple, because bees can recognize the UV radiation. So plants are very highly colored, such as yellow, appear as that bees purple color, which is why a lot of like the sunflowers are like have that yellow coloration and are brightly colored to match whatever the bee wants. Then parasitism, this one there's not really much to it. It's just one benefits, the other is harmed in this specific area, but it's like parasites. So we have a tick right here, which is like a parasite by spreading bacteria to the human. You can sort of brush over that. And then there's commensalism and immensalism. So commensalism, you probably, or good chance you've heard of it. It's where one benefits and the other is unaffected. For example, we have right here, where the different fish are sort of living along the, they're like tagging along the shark. But then there's one that I didn't really know about this until like the beginning of this year. So it's pretty recent, but I haven't heard about this in school, but it's commensalism. Commensalism is when one is affected, but the other is harmed. So you might be thinking, well, how did this happen? Or one is not affected, but the other is harmed. Like, how can an organism harm another animal without affecting it? Well, you all do it all the time. Whenever you walk on grass, you're harming the grass. You're physically stepping on it, but you're not being affected at all. It doesn't benefit you and it doesn't harm you whenever you step on grass. So that's how commensalism works. It's something that people don't really talk about, but it happens in our day-to-day lives. Okay, now let's transition more into ecosystem ecology, or more of the interaction between this and like energy. So food chains and food webs. If you have ever done a biology thing in school, you've probably learned about food chains and food webs. They do it a lot, and it doesn't get any better when you move on to high school because you still talk about them. But it's still good to know about food chains. But rather than just saying like, oh, you have primary producers, primary consumers, etc., then there's also like the energetic areas about food chains and food webs, which are good to know. So we have energy, obviously starts in the sun, because all the energy that we get from the light energy from the sun. And then it goes to the primary producers, for example, the plants, which use the sunlight to make photosynthesis, or do photosynthesis, which makes a lot of energy and ATP, and it also makes sugar and glucose molecules. And then it goes to the primary consumers, which eat them. They're the herbivores, the secondary consumers, the tertiary consumers, and then the apex predators. So that's the food chain. We have the food web, which is also the interconnected food chains coming all together. But one thing to cool about the food chains is that you see the food chains are usually only like five organisms long, including the primary producer. This is explained by the energetic hypothesis, which also is based upon the 10% rule, which you might have heard of. This shows that primary producers they gain 100% of the energy it makes. They don't really lose that energy because they take the sun's energy. 100% of the sun's energy is what they have. It's all there, the starting point of energy for all the rest of the organisms. So you have the primary consumers. If they eat these primary producers, because the primary producers are using a lot of this energy as heat in metabolic processes, such as such as energy creation, respiration, the primary consumers only get 10% of this energy outcome. And then the same thing happens. Secondary consumers only get 1%. Tertiary consumers only get 0.1%. And the apex predators eating the third level consumers only get 0.01%. That's why people say like eating plants and having like a vegan lifestyle, or like eating just a lot of plants, is a much more efficient source of energy, because they contain a lot of the energy there and you still be consuming 10% of it. But this shows how the food chains are limited, because even getting 0.01% of energy is not a lot of energy. So it limits the amount of organisms that can be there, because an organism probably couldn't survive on 0.001% of energy. So that's why it limits the amount that the food chain is stretched out. One way though is just that these food chains sound like they're isolated in ecosystems, but with obviously the food webs show that different organisms a different thing that they also eat, which means that it's not just limited to one thing. For example, let's say a hawk eating a snake. Hawks don't just eat snakes, they could eat other things as well. So yeah, you can also see that a lot of the energy is left out as heat to the environment where it's not able to be used again. And then you also have decomposers. Decomposers, they take the dead remains of all these different organisms and they recycle nutrients back to primary producers for them to be able to use. For example, fungi, like we talked about earlier, as a decomposer, they take a lot of the organisms or nutrients such as nitrogen, and they recycle that back to primary producers in the soil. Then the primary producers, like the plants, can use that nitrogen through the mycorrhizal interactions to actually do stuff for the cell to make energy, etc., and undergo different processes. So you can see here that a lot of the energy is actually cycled. It's like a one-way cycle for energy, go from sun to heat. But for nutrients, it's actually cycled in an organism. This question I've actually seen appear on the USAVO. It talks about how the difference between nutrient cycles and energy cycles. Energy cycles are unidirectional. They go from the sun to being lost as heat. But then you have the nutrient cycles, which are recycled. So they are actually cycling within an organism or cycling within an ecosystem. Okay, I think that's the end of the slides I have here. So with the last 13 minutes of class left, I'll reserve the class until around 2:55 today. But for the last 8 minutes, I guess, if anyone has any questions or wants you to go visit any slides, please ask in the chat below, because yeah, there's a lot less to cover with ecology. So if you want me to talk about anything more specifically, then just type it in the Q&A. Yeah. If I find something a bit more interesting, we can talk about that as well. Someone asked in chat, could you elaborate on ATP or ATC? Okay, I didn't talk about ATP in this class, but let me think about what that would be. Yeah, I'm not sure what you're talking about. Sorry. Yeah, maybe if you could think about it again, put the answer again in chat. Sorry. But I'll go to the other questions. Can you go over the population graphs again or go to the slide? Yeah, sure. So right here, we show the population graphs. Can you type in chat what more like specifically about those things you want to go over? Or if you want me to like go to the slide so you can like maybe take notes. Or I'll just like describe this for a bit. So the survivorship curves. Okay, so yeah, the survivorship curves specifically. Okay, cool. So they mainly talk about how like organisms survive as their age. So type 1 survivorship curves show that at a young age, the organism tends to survive a lot higher, or survives a lot higher percentage. For example, in babies and humans, we survive a lot more when we're younger, but then we start to die off whenever we're older. And then it's the opposite for trees, where they produce a lot of different offspring, but since the environmental conditions are a lot more variable, they tend to die off when they're younger. But then over time, if they didn't die off, they survive a very long life. Then type 2 means that they just die and survive at a relatively stable rate in birds, which like hawks. Sorry if I didn't answer your question, but I have to go to the other ones too. You go back on the first few slides. Cool. So the first few slides talk about the levels of ecology. We have the population ecology. Yeah, so then we have the population ecology, which describes the interactions of the same species. Community ecology, which is the interaction between the different populations. An ecosystem, which is the interaction between the communities, not only the communities, but also the non-living and abiotic factors. And then we have the landscape ecology, which is those connected ecosystems. And finally, the global ecology, which is the study of the biosphere. So another one is the overview of climate. Basically, just saying that how like temperature patterns, organisms need to survive at certain temperatures. So climate describes, or the climate change show that organisms have to adapt to rising temperatures, etc. We also have climate graphs, which can show how which can also show the distribution of precipitation and temperatures over different time periods to the months. Then global distribution shows the different factors that control distribution. We have dispersal, which is like its ability to fly away or move to a different area. Biotic factors such as predators, which limit the distribution of a prey species going from one area to another. Then abiotic factors, which shows how like mountains, for example, or precipitation can affect how an organism moves to a different area, which can limit its distribution. So next someone asked about dispersion. Perfect. So there's 3 types of dispersion, and the main definition of dispersion we're going to talk about is it's the pattern of spacing among the individuals within the boundaries of a population. So let's say the boundaries of the population are these black like squares. Wait, can someone type in chat if you can see the figure on this slide, or is it too dark? If someone just type in the chat, not the Q&A, if y'all can see this figure. Anyone? Oh, you can see it. Oh yeah, cool. Make sure just type something in chat. Don't type it in the Q&A. If I would like, yeah, okay. Let's do this. Okay, so yeah, so dispersion, we have uniform, clumped, and random. We talk about uniform sort of like they're arranged such as points on a grid. This can be shown by territoriality by like, okay, I'm marking my territory, don't come near here. So other organisms just stay away, and they have this like mutual, not hate, but territoriality and aggression towards each other. They don't invade their like territory. We have random, which you talked about how it's like the sunflowers. It's like the seeds are being like wind blown. The wind carries the seeds. The wind's very random. It doesn't have a direction. So it causes the organisms to be dispersed randomly in this population. And finally, we have clumped, which is like if certain areas are like a nutrient hotspot, the organisms tend to clump around it to get those nutrients. So this is how it'd be for clumped. Did that answer your question? Whoever asked about like the dispersion? Or is there anything more you want me to talk about specifically? All right. Did anyone else have any other questions? I can answer maybe a couple more, and I'll give you all some time to do the survey. Yeah, I'll give around like 2 minutes-ish. Right? If no one has any questions, I'll still give you some time left since we technically have until 3 o'clock. But if no one has any questions for now, once again, the slides will be posted on KTK website along with the recording sometime later tonight. And I'm going to stop the share for now, and I'm going to find the link for the survey. Oh yeah, if you already did the survey last time, I know there's some other people though, but if you already did it or done it, then it's the same link. So you can just redo it or submit the form again. So let me just find the link again. Or show the directions to get it. Okay. Yeah, so if you go on the KTK website, there is a on like 2022 Meta Summer Camp on the drop-down menu. Let me screen share over here. On this drop-down menu, there is a I can move. Yeah, but right here there is student survey. If you go here, click down, it'll take you to a survey and fill it out. It's loading. Yeah. Other thing is yeah, be honest in your survey. It's good for the KTK staff so we can see how to improve the classes for future lessons. All right, 5 minutes left. Is there any other questions about the class or maybe biology, like competition biology in general? Cause I'll be happy. So in that time you can fill out the survey or ask any like question about the lesson or biology, be happy to ask or happy to answer them.